Greetings and welcome to the UCSD Visual Arts Department Visiting Speakers Program. I'm Grant Kester, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Carlos Garrido Castellano, Greetings and welcome to the UCSD Visual Arts Department Visiting Speakers Program. Let me just turn that off. Apologies. And anyway, I'm delighted to welcome Carlos to the department. And Carlos is someone whose research I've followed for many years and have great admiration for. His work in the areas of socially engaged art practice, activist art, and so on. So I'm going to give us a short introduction. It could be much longer because of all the amazing work that Carlos has done. But this is a brief introduction, and then we'll turn things over to Carlos. So Carlos is associate professor and senior lecturer at the University College Cork, that's in Ireland, where he coordinates a BA program in Portuguese studies. He is also an associate researcher at the Visual Identities in Art and Design program at the University of Johannesburg. Carlos is the author of several books, including Beyond Representation in Contemporary Caribbean Art, Rutgers University Press 2019, Art Activism for an Anti-Colonial Future, that's SUNY Press 2021, and Literary Fictions of the Contemporary Art System, Routledge 2023, as well as two other monographs in Spanish and one in Portuguese. He's one of the most important scholars to have expanded the critical discourse around socially engaged art practice to address Caribbean, Afro-diasporic, and anti-colonial practices globally. Carlos is also the principal investigator of the Irish Research Council's Laureate Consolidator Project, assessing the contemporary art novel in Spanish and Portuguese, cultural labor, personal identification, and the materialization of alternative art worlds, which will run from September 2023 to September 2027. And I suspect it's from this body of new research that Carlos will be drawing for his remarks to us today. So welcome, Carlos. Very excited to hear your thoughts. And after the talk, we'll have time for some questions, some Q&A through the YouTube channel. So thanks so much for joining us, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Greg. Grant. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I visited San Diego a few years ago, and it was a pleasure exchanging with the colleagues in the department, and I'm really happy for being for this opportunity to be back there, even if it is online. I'll be presenting today something that is very much work in progress, that has to do with this new project that is starting. I have to say that it's a collaborative project, a project that has to do with trying to answer the question of how we make sense of ourselves by making sense of what we do with creativity, with cultural and artistic creativity, but also what cultural and artistic creativity does to us. So I'll try to synthesize today some preliminary thoughts about this new project that is also connected to previous work, and I'll try myself to share my screen. I'll time myself, and I think I have 55 minutes, so I would appreciate if someone could let me know if I go over that. The first thing I wanted to mention is that you will see today something that takes the shape of a story. I think it matters how we tell stories. I think it matters which stories we tell and how we approach the process of narrating, the process of making sense of something. So the form here is important. And in relation to form, I just wanted to say that you will see different things today. So you will see questions, and these questions are not just slides, are not just part of my argument. They are really real questions that I wanted to ask you, that I wanted to ask myself, because I don't have the answer, because I think these questions matter to us, not just because we care about what we do with art, what art does to us, but also because I think they go beyond specific domains, specific mediums, specific fields, and they make us wonder what are we doing with creativity? What are the effects of how we create, how we care, how we collaborate with others? The other thing you will see are stories. So this is a story made of different stories, and you will. I just wanted to introduce you to 10 amazing novels, 10 amazing books. So I'll be including fragments of these novels, and you will see that at your right, and then you will see a summary of everything I will be commenting on your left. I wanted to juxtapose. I wanted to bring together these two elements just to highlight the idea that practice can be an effective source of thinking. Practice makes space for its own thinking, for its own theory. And I wanted to juxtapose these two elements just to remark this belief in the potential of practitioners and creative practice to produce interesting ideas, to produce ideas that, let's say, are more difficult to produce when it comes to just theoretical approaches to creativity that happen afterwards. Okay, so let me just start by asking, what makes a life fashionable? Why should we care about the things we care? What is at stake in caring about creativity? What do we create by following different paths, by following different lifelines, by engaging with others, by assuming that we are not alone, that we are always moving, that we are always positioning ourselves, that we are always changing and looking and turning. And I'm following here Sarah Ahmed and this idea of that following something, meaning that engaging with the politics of lifelines, of the idea that we keep following, we keep engaging with different forces, with different sources, with different bodies, with different voices. And this is a way of producing ourselves while we produce something else that will produce something in between, something other than just subjects. The first story I wanted to tell you happens in France in 1831, at the beginning of the 19th century, and it has three main protagonists: the real painter, the real artist, Nicolas Poussin, Porbu, and Frank Hofer. Frank Hofer is a genius, is a master, is the person who taught everything to Porbu. And in this amazing short story created by Honoré de Balzac, uh, Poussin visits the atelier of Porbu, and they have an amazing conversation about art, a very interesting conversation about art. And then, as part of this exchange, the master, Fraunhofer, comes into the scene and finishes a beautiful painting that Porbu was producing. Fraunhofer, however, is tormented because of his incapacity to create the perfect work of art. He assumes that if he had the perfect conditions, if he found the perfect model for this, he would be able to make the total work of art, the most beautiful painting ever, a painting that is much more than a painting. Sorry for the spoiler. Frank Hofer goes to his atelier. Poussin's lover decides to pose to act as a model for him. The genius artist closes himself, separates himself from the rest of the world, and just paints and just reflects on the act of creating, of painting. Porbu and Poussin visit the master just to find that Fraunhofer has invented contemporary modern art by creating a very abstract creation that no one understands, that is just an amalgam of colors that only Fraunhofer can enjoy, that only Fraunhofer can appreciate. Fraunhofer becomes very angry, becomes mad, and ends up dying that very night. The artist novel, the Künstlerroman, is considered to be an important literary genre. People such as James Joyce, Goethe, Thomas Mann, Balzac dedicated not just one novel, but many novels to reflect on the lives and loves of artists. They made artists' lives fashionable lives in order to define what a creative genius could look like. This genre, therefore, is crucial, is instrumental for the consolidation of the novel as the main literary genre. Okay? What is at stake in this process, I would say, is more than literature, because by creating this genius, by talking about what creativity could do in these perfect ideal conditions, writers were making space for their own right to enjoy social prestige, their own right to consider themselves autonomous creators, isolated, kind of partially independent, at least, from social constraints. Okay, this is a story of artists and writers looking at each other. It's not just about representations of art. What happens in Fraunhofer's atelier is a model. Okay, what I wanted to suggest to begin is that this model is also a contract. By reading these lives of artists, by reading these stories about how creative genius can become crazy about creativity, can ultimately die and live and love around paintings, by keeping paintings at the center, readers establish a contract with writers, but also with the entire society, with a society that is struggling to deal with the consequences of revolutionary processes, but also in which a bourgeois middle class new group is trying to position itself at the center of social exchanges. This new bourgeois middle class wants to experience the excitement of creativity, wants to travel far, wants to see something new, wants to experience the unknown, but doesn't want to risk too much. The lives of artists, and especially the fictionalized lives of artists, work in that sense as a contract, in the sense that the reader can enjoy, can enter the fiction, and at least temporarily become a creative genius as well, with this within the safe confines of the house, of the private house of middle class French citizens in these late romantic, early realistic moments. So we can say that the artist novel is not just a representation of how art works, but it's also a way of justifying which lives matter and how. It's a way of socializing by telling the stories of artists. It's a way of socializing by highlighting that artists are more than artists, that artists are model for the rest of society, that by becoming an artist, people can become individual, but also that by becoming individual, we become citizens, we become subjects. This is a very productive, but also a very conservative genealogy. And I wanted to make the case for a critical questioning of the artist novel as more than a literary genre, in the sense that this tradition is a tradition that determines how people socialize themselves, that determine that people how people conceive themselves of as individuals, but also this is also a genealogy, a story about how individualism and individualization acted and functioned as a way of subjection, as a way of controlling social relationships, by highlighting that individualism is at the center, should be at the center of them. Okay, so the equation between individuation, subjection, and subject formation starts with the art novel. Uh, what I want to read today, when I want to engage with the questions I have, are not about the art novel. The art novel, it's amazing. It's interesting because it's one of the most conservative genealogies within contemporary literature. I would say within contemporary creativity, cultural creativity at large, in the sense that most of the well-known examples were written by white middle-class men who had this dream of becoming the next creative genius, and who conceived their connection with romanticism and their modernism in quite individualizing, highly autonomous ways. My interest today, however, has to do with what I mentioned, what I call the contemporary art novel. Okay, this is an example from Argentina. It's a very recent novel written by Maria Gainza. Maria Gainza is an art historian. Okay, it's an art historian who writes fictions. In this book, we read Maria reading paintings, engaging with artworks from different periods. Some of them are from the Museo de Bellas Artes de Buenos Aires, from the Museum of Fine Arts, and the main contemporary, modern arts museum in Argentina. And in this body of work, which is made of short stories, Maria portrays herself as hunting, as struggling to define her own voice. This art historian, not just Maria Gainza herself, but the narrator, is a very specific, very peculiar art historian. Is a very peculiar critic. But at another level, she is like anybody. She is like anyone, any of us, in the sense that, for example, in one of the short stories, this art historian cannot see well. She needs her glasses all the time, and there is a moment when she forgot her glasses. So her capacity to engage, to say something interesting, something clever, something that could solve the mystery lying behind specific artistic processes, failed just because of the mundane, practical, material, quite tangible detail that has to do with her own practicalities, with the conditions of living, with her own body, with her own medical, emotional, affective condition. Maria Gainza, the narrator, not the narrative, not the writer, struggles to see herself separate from the kind of process of commenting and criticizing and elaborating our histories, national but also transnational. So we can see how the contemporary art novel is what happens when art and life become blur, when neoliberalism collapses the distance between arts and art making and life. So this is a kind of fiction that goes beyond medium-based creativity, not by chance. Most of the writers that I'll be commenting on are also artists, are also visual artists. Some of them are even musicians, some of them are architects. They work and they conceive of the task of telling stories as something that goes beyond writing books, writing novels. So we can see that the form of the novel, that is this quintessential bourgeois object, buying novels, reading novels in our private house, being this process of being the key of this process of socialization I was mentioning before. It's also a key, a door towards a different and radical and alternative way of engaging with artistic imperatives, and how these imperatives are affecting more and more of us in processes of neoliberalization. So we can see that this new genre, this continuation of their novel, it's also connected to post-autonomous artistic production and narratives of the self, because both writers and artists are experiencing the consequences of creative capitalism and neoliberalism, and they are seeing the many ways in which art and life have become blurred, have become connected, but also the possibilities and the limitations of that connection. Okay, so in this case, this almost myopic narrator tells a story that is not just a story about artists, it's a story about art itself. It's a story about how art is deeply entangled into processes of global logistics, into the construction and the reproduction of institutional power and privilege, but also of the limitations of the, on one hand, universalism and the demands for universalism of this formula, this equation between individuation, subjection, and subject formation, that is crucial for the establishment of a bourgeois middle class, but also of capitalism along the 19th century and early 20th century. So this new genre, this new body of fiction is highly active in problematizing how this formula, on one hand, tries to perpetuate itself, tries to naturalize itself, but also on the other, it's just a formula, it's just a story we tell. So that's why I started mentioning that the way in which we tell stories and the stories we choose to tell matter a lot, because they will determine the kind of futures, the kind of options that we have available. My next question is how creative impact is impacting us. Okay, we tend to think about impact as something we make. We make impact. We determine things. We justify our lives by justifying how useful, how relevant it is, everything we do. Okay, so creative imperatives are also personal imperatives. They are about the blurring space that happens when the private and the public are blurred, that happens when professional and personal life are interconnected. So in which ways can we think about impact as something that is happening to us, as something that we don't fully control, as something that we are suffering? There are many ways of telling this story, and there are many ways of responding to this. One of my favorites comes from Chile, and comes from a not very well known novel by the very well known novelist Roberto Bolaño. In this story, we follow Carlos Vider, uh, a very prolific conceptual artist, making art and studying and making interesting ideas in 1970s Chile, just before the Pinochet coup. There is a moment in the story in which Vider wants to create the perfect work of art, and he decides to put together his passion for aviation, his capacity to pilot an airplane, with his interest in conceptual art. And you can imagine the results. As Chile becomes a horrific dictatorship, as planes start falling, dropping bodies, as people start disappearing, as people start falling, as the entire country starts falling apart, these pilots, these artists, finds himself at the center of both processes, as the most capable subject to begin the story that will become the history of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism starts with the 9/11 in Chile, okay, the coup in Chile. So we can see how neoliberalism and creative capitalism is not just about the gentrification of cities in the late 20th century. We can think about both as a planetary project, as something that was ongoing at least from the 1970s, that's something that has planetary consequences, consequences that go beyond specific cities, specific projects. And we can also see how the figure of the creative genius can be provincialized, can become a global figure. How by reading books such as Estrella Distante, Distant Star, we can start to understand that these creative imperatives were hounding uh, regimes that were different from those we find in the Western world, in which we can see the transition between Fordism to post-Fordism as a landmark moment in the configuration of uh, non-material, let's say, of cultural, creative, theory, idea-based ways of producing. And we can see how fiction, it's also at the forefront, is imagining, is problematizing the consequences of what a planetary history of authoritarianism, logistics, and art can look like. How all these things, planetary changes, authoritarianism, not just in the present, not just in relation to far-right movements in the present, but also within this long-term story that reaches back up to the middle and late 20th century, and logistics. And I'm following here Fred Moting and Stefano Harney, and the idea that logistics are about the displacement of objects and bodies and voices is something that we only partially control, is something that encapsulates the more than human dimension of world changing processes such as the slave trade, such as the explosion of the financialization of everything. So we can see that Vider creating his work of art in the sky in Chile, while he was serving and producing this kind of horrible necropolitical service to the Pinochet dictatorship, is also inaugurating another way of conceiving of the creative genius, a creative genius that is quite comfortable with the new conditions of creative capitalism, but also with the quite long-lasting conditions of authoritarianism and dictatorship in a very blur public political context. Okay? Another very interesting example comes from Brazil. And Patricia Melo is a fascinating writer who mixes different genres. And in this one, Gog Magog, we follow two siblings. One of them is a performer artist, and the other one is a person obsessed with his physical body, with his appearance. The artist, she is using her body to call attention to the many ways in which normative bodies are mobilized as a way of normalizing violence and institutional privilege in contemporary Brazil. His brother is obsessed with improving his own body as a way of fitting in this new society. They live in a large city in Brazil, but the novel is not about the differences between both, but rather about the connections and about the dreams and about how creative imperatives become a central part of how we imagine ourselves. But also, this novel is about what are the consequences, what are the implications of having to imagine ourselves as creative figures, as creative individuals, and the focus on individualization is crucial here. So we can see that the art novel is not just a literary genre. Art novels nowadays, and this is something I love telling my students, are also Instagram profiles, are also how we curate ourselves in social media. Art novels are not just about novels and art, they are also about self-appreciation, self-curation, but also how about how individuation, it's also the one of the most favorite, one of the most common ways in which we are subjected, in which we are made to obey, made to comply. Okay, so we can see in Gog Magog the fact that these kind of fictions matter because we are really suffering the art and life equation. We are the result of the appropriation of this equation, this dream, this utopian dream of the avant-garde of liberating life by introducing arts, by politicizing uh, everyday life, but also by aestheticizing politics. So we can see that this body of fictions can be read as something more than a genre talking about another medium, literary genre talking about another medium, sorry. This is about creative imperatives and contemporary ranking and artistic anxieties and the many ways in which these things affect us. Because I really believe that there is no single way, there is no universal way. When it comes to creative imperatives, we suffer creativity in context sensitive ways. Our bodies, our positionality, our position, our institutional position, sorry, our personal choices, our affective uh, context determines to what extent and how we are haunted by creative imperatives. This brings me to another very important question: who pays for our contemporary global creative economies? This is crucial in the context in which I live, Ireland, in which the idea of attracting capital, attracting creativity and innovation plays a central role in redefining not just the economy of the country, but also the future of the island, of crafting a new image of a country that up to recently was a very rural society and now is defined by being the place where all the big high-tech companies are attracted, including Apple, Amazon, etc., etc. So who pays for our global creative economies? And what happens when we tell the story of what is behind this apparently immaterial process of creating and making culture and turning culture, at least conceiving of culture as a cultural and economic resource? I have many answers to this, and writers have much more. I just wanted to bring one that happens in contemporary Angola, in Luanda. This is one of my favorites. In Os Transparentes by Onjaki, we follow a very multifaceted group of citizens of Luanda who inhabit a unique building in the city center. Imagine that this building has several floors. In the first floor, there is a swimming pool, but it's not a swimming pool. It's a leak that had created an artificial swimming pool that is used by people. In this building, everybody tries to profit, and all sorts of pseudo-cultural and cultural initiatives arise. All of them are powered by a single cable. This cable comes from the presidential house. So imagine electricity and energy and oil powering art centers, uh, literally powering art centers, cinemas, uh, artist managed spaces, uh, private initiatives, entrepreneurs, scammers, etc., etc., etc. So this is a novel that tells us that art and energy and logistics are part of the same story. In other words, this is not just about our objects and our subjects. This is also about how energy and energy capitalism is mobilizing arts also to justify, to normalize a particular state of things in which recolonization can happen by oil economies. So we are talking here about something, about a novel that proves that colonial afterlives are equal, are about the reproduction of colonialism in the same way, in the same form that it acquired in the past. What we learn by reading Onjaki is that Angolans, Luandans, are playing a very active role in imagining the future, in configuring their own way to put together creativity, energy, water, and very tangible natural resources. We can see here as well that entrepreneurialism is not something arising out of a Richard Florida-like urban environment. Entrepreneurialism has a global story that is yet to be told. And in the same way that creative cities and creative capitals should not be seen as the result of an aspirational model that affects the West first and then the rest of the world. On the contrary, we should look at places like Luanda, and especially post revolutionary, post independence Luanda. And this affects not just Angola, but also many other African cities, as models in which art, oil, plutocracy, and neoliberalism come together, changing and shaping how people see themselves, but also how people act. Okay, so we can also see that these novels are tales of improvisation and informality, and this make them radical. This make them much more than a representation of how things are. Again, by choosing the stories we tell, by choosing how we tell stories, we are choosing what kind of future we can envisage. So, how do alternative art worlds look like? And this is a vague question, but I wanted to make the case for us to read this question as something very tangible, very material, very down to earth. Okay, this is a question that really should affect us, because these alternative art worlds condition our capacity to imagine a future, to imagine livable futures. Again, writers and artists do this much better than people thinking, I think, that's academics. And I wanted to introduce Rita Indiana. I wanted to introduce you to Rita Indiana Hernandez, a fascinating queer activist, novelist, installation artist, leader of a pop music band from the Dominican Republic. And in this fascinating novel that was translated into English as Tentacle, she imagines this artist who spends a lot of years in a fine art schools. He is known because of his talent to paint like Francisco de Goya, the Spanish genius. Then he goes to this private art school that is a franchise of the Parsons School of Design that Parsons created in the Caribbean. It's a real space, it's a real school. And he realizes that everything he knows about art is useless because everything is changing. And he realizes that the Dominican Republic is shaped by two different cultural worlds, two different cultural environments. One that is, highlights the national and highlights this connection with the tradition, another one that is trying to catch up, is trying to experiment with different forms. The interesting thing is that this novel brings together gender transitioning, time traveling. There is a moment in which the entire ocean, the entire Caribbean ocean, gets destroyed, and art and a social engaged initiative in this novel ends up profiting from this destruction, but also ultimately saving the oceans. So we have these artists questioning what kind of role they play. And this novel tells us that imagining art is also imagining queer futures, it's also queering the art system. Because when we write a novel, we are not bounded, we are not constrained. And this is not, again, this is not about writing novels, this is about telling stories and assuming that we can tell the same story, we can act and think and tell in different multiple ways. So telling stories is about queering their world. And in the same way, art making can be time traveling. This involves engaging with genealogies that are there in the past, that are very much alive. Okay, but it also imagines imagining the future. This also implies, sorry, imagining the future and establishing a connection with multiple alternative futures. Okay, this also has to do with the task, one of the most interesting, useful task that artists and writers are engaging with nowadays, which is restitution. Okay, in this story, we see that this is a story by a British Nigerian writer who comes back home and decides to visit his home place, in the sense that he considers himself Nigerian but also British, and he hasn't been in Nigeria for a long while. And there's a moment in the novel when he visits an art museum and he engages with the empty shelf, with the empty spaces. Okay, by making sense of this space that is not commonly talked about in processes of reparation and restitution, he's telling the story that things move on, that things continued, and that reparation is not just about institutions in the global north making a favor to institutions in the global and people in the global south. He imagines the empty shelf as something that can be sounded, that something that can be mobilized. He imagines restitution against Eurocentrism. He conceives of restitution as a material, but also symbolic, fictional, but also realistic process that involves reversing travel narratives, that involves questioning the writers, the artists, the cultural managers' positionality and implication involvement into this story. So we can see how restitution works as a story. Restitution tells the story of things being wrongly made. Restitution is also about telling the story that by making things right, we are also creating an alternative future. We are also rereading the consequences of colonialism, and we are also mobilizing objects and bodies and images and voices for an alternative, more just, more fair future. This is done in many ways, and I wanted to bring you to Peru now by exploring Les Niñas de Oro de la Alquimia Sexual by Tilsa Ota. Tilsa is a Peruvian writer and poet and cultural manager and social engaged producer who lives in Mexico City. And in this novel, he recovers the mystic visions of Hildegard von Winden and brings them to contemporary Peru. And the novel follows the track of a young group of cultural managers. They run an artist managed space, a collective, collaborative, social engaged art project. And but at the same time, one of them becomes obsessed with mysticism and eroticism, and she starts bringing together both spheres up to a moment in which her entire commitment to social change starts becoming more realistic, starts also at the same time starts becoming more experimental because of her engagement with her own affects and limitations and practicalities of their life. This is a novel that tells us that engaging a project, joining a project, has to do a lot with orientation. I want to bring Sarah Ahmed here again, and this idea that we create lifelines. We don't just reproduce behaviors and patterns. We are not just surveil control beings. We create our own lifelines, and we can choose, we can turn, we can look at, and we can modulate. Sorry. Our connections, our positionality, our interactions. And by doing this, we are creating an alternative social imagination. We are socializing ourselves. We are transforming socialization beyond individualization, beyond this equation I presented previously. So we can see how by telling these stories, we can unlearn, we can position care as a critical, creative, artistic, aesthetic tactic. We can see how creativity emerges out of precariousness, but also how emotions and affect can be valuable resources in producing something new, in reimagining the new. Final points: by telling, we are turning, by turning, we socialize, we create a new society, a new sociality, but we are also disidentifying ourselves. We are refusing to be creative beings. We are refusing to be individuals. We are refusing to be following Fred Moten just one single thing. And I have two examples of this, and I'll be very brief because I already spent 40 minutes. The first one is by another Brazilian writer, Julian Fuchs, and this novel is called Ocupação, The Occupation. And in this case, we follow a writer who very much looks like the writer himself, Julian, who visits his father, who is about to die, but at the same time ends up joining an occupied building, an occupied space in Sao Paulo. This occupied space is a space of survival. It's not a cultural center. However, in this occupied space, all sorts of cultural initiatives start emerging, start happening. The novel is not about Julian or the narrator and or the narrator telling us about this process. The novel is about the incapacities, the difficulties, the complications of engaging, listening, thinking with other people. So this is a novel that questions that fiction is always individual, it's always about individual authorship. This is a novel that tries transindividual and transindividual fiction and transindividualism. This is a concept that comes from Spinoza, so it's a very old concept that has been revised and revitalized in the past 2 decades. And transindividualism, to put it simple, is the space in between, is everything that happens in between individualism and collectivism. It's about saying that individualism always happens within collectivism, and the collective is also conditioned by, but also shaped by different ways of conceiving of individualism. Okay, this is a novel that tries to find ways of dealing with occupation processes, but also of creating through occupying different genres, different spaces. In this novel, written within the Bolsonaro years, we can see how non-privileged voices within Sao Paulo are giving voice here, are integrated within the narration. And this is not just a benevolent, paternalistic gesture by Fuchs. This is rather a way of questioning the tradition and the canon of Brazilian literature in which there is this fascination with especially male-centered powerful voices, and I'm summarizing here a lot. I could go into this in detail, but it's also about affirming that occupation and occupying is always occupying professionalism, authorship, and autonomy at the same time. This is a novel that positions the reader and the writer both in a precarious position, and that compels us to listen to precarious voices and to understand how precariousness works in highly selective ways. Precariousness cannot be conceived as a universal force affecting us all in equal terms. On the contrary, precariousness precarizes the more precarious. But at the same time, precariousness opens up spaces for communication that happen and for exchange and interaction that happen beyond the well-established confines and the safe confines of the art institution or the cultural institution, but also of professionalization, formal education, and class relationships. I finished going to Ecuador and reading Nefando, a fascinating novel that Monica Ojeda published a couple of years ago. I don't remember the exact date, but a few years ago, in which we follow a group of Ecuadorian scholarship holders who live in Barcelona and who want to create a video game, a radical, gore, crazy video game as a way of conjuring up, as a way of fighting the ghosts that they inherit because of their uh, coloniality, because of their relation with coloniality, but also because of their traumatic experience, personal experience, familiar experience. So we see a group of young creators, three from Ecuador, sorry, one from Mexico, another one from Barcelona, living a marginal life, trying to survive out of a precarious scholarship that doesn't allow them to pay more than uh, doesn't allow them to enjoy life in Barcelona, to have a minimal positive life conditions in Barcelona. And we can see how creating a video game arises for this group of people as an opportunity to do something together, but also to transform and recompose the social digital, to use digital technologies. And I go here and engage here with a idea by Gerd Loving that social media is antisocial by definition. That social media doesn't socialize us, doesn't make us more social, but rather social media becomes this kind of platform, but also narrative that makes space for antisocial behavior by creating and curating ourselves through social media. There is a tendency to generate more individualization. So we can see how, in this case, prosumerism is strongly linked, is closely linked to this process, to this centuries-old process of becoming an artist, but also for this group of creators, creating a video game, working together in an art project that is also a video game, that is also a scam, that is also a way of sampling digital resources. It's a way of recomposing the social digital, because the social and the digital is no longer distinguishable. And this is where new narratives are emerging. These are my 10 stories, but I just wanted to mention that there is much more. I haven't brought here things from places other than Africa and Latin America, and I wanted to bring more examples because, for example, we can read Gabriela Wiener's Huaco Retrato, which is a fascinating novel about her connection with the robbery of colonial objects in Peru. Uh, we can read Peregrino Transparente by Juan Cárdenas from Colombia. It's a novel that engages with artists who were involved in the botanical and scientific expeditions in Latin America. Félix Fras from Puerto Rico, Padura from Cuba, Hatun from Brazil, Verónica Gerber from Mexico, Pedro Mairal from Argentina, or Yasmina Barrera from Mexico. So we can read many more novels. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that this is a tendency, but it's more than a tendency. This is my main idea. Again, by telling stories, by choosing which stories we tell, we are also configuring and determining how we can imagine the future. And this is not just about the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking world. We could focus, there are a lot of things going on in the US. There are many examples, very interesting examples in Ireland. There are many interesting examples in Asia as well. There are many interesting examples being published and being circulated and happening in languages that are not European languages, that are indigenous languages. So today I just offer a very short summary. I just wanted to highlight that this is part of an ongoing project that has to do with exploring the boom of contemporary art novels in relation to artistic and the end of artistic and creative capitalism, and how uh, artificial intelligence, but also neo-fascism are replacing this idea of artistic capitalism and this imperative to curate ourselves. The idea that we are imagining another world in order to imagine another world. And I bring here, for example, performances engaging with the murder of Ana Mendieta, and how by telling the story of how Ana Mendieta was murdered, we are fighting patriarchal behaviors, we are fighting colonialism, and we are fighting the implications and the connivance of our institutions and cultural institutions and academic and social institutions in this process. But this is also about understanding cultural creativity otherwise. There are many things happening, and I just wanted to bring this here to highlight that we are working a lot on this. We are creating the first database of contemporary art novels, but we're also making a space for people to tell us how they are reading, what they are reading, and the stories they want to tell. We are publishing, we are writing, we are coordinating, we are creating a podcast, we are organizing an exhibition. And there will be lots of things coming on in 2024, including a partnership with Extinction Rebellion, a seminar on 3 seminars on the impact of impacts, something on modernization, democracy in the Spanish state, many other things. If you want to read more about this, I'll be happy to share these resources with you. This is the final book, the last book I wrote on this topic, and this is part of a series of essays on how writing and contemporary creativity open up spaces for possible spaces, but also spaces of possibility in contemporary Brazil. Just wanted to mention that in relation to this trend, in relation to this topic, I'm also working on something on cultural labor and global contemporary fiction in Portuguese, another project on art democratization and modernization in Spain, precariousness and the process of recovery in Portugal. This is very important because in the case of Portugal, we find this narrative that culture and cultural production made Portugal a fancy, fashionable place internationally, globally. And we can mention here how Lonely Planet chose Lisbon as the most attractive city to visit a few years ago. And this had to do with the uniqueness of Lisbon and Portugal because of the connection with Africa. But this connection with Africa is, of course, the result of Portugal being the most long lasting colonizer in history, and how culture is selectively used to highlight but also to hide this connection. So we are exploring that in relation to the process of recovering from the financial crisis that happened in 2008, sorry, but and also to question who is recovering from what, to what extent different individuals, to what extent gender and race are affected by this narrative of recovery, by this narrative that like things are okay again, that things have become normal again. Uh, we are questioning and we are exploring the Irish version of the impact of impacts. Again, working in Ireland, having been here for 5 years, I become aware of the importance of models of innovation, entrepreneurialism that are, I would say, quite unique, quite different. Uh, Again, being exposed to, for example, the influence of high tech companies, mega tech companies that come to Ireland because they don't pay taxes or they pay less taxes, and then simplifying things a lot. So we are trying to study how impact and art driven and creative cultural driven impact is impacting us, is affecting our lives, and how creators collectively but also individually are responding to impact in powerful, productive and provocative ways. We are also trying to analyze how digital media and telling stories and connecting and sharing and collaborating in digital media is rebuilding the social. And more, I'm also writing on a novel, on a new monograph on the carnivalization of politics, and the idea that sonic politics are also politics, that sonic exchanges have a political dimension beyond the content, beyond the representation of specific political messages. Something on reconceptualizing Caribbean modernism, and something on art making radical creativity in Portugal. Because I wanted to finish with these examples just to highlight that this connection with this, what I presented today about the art novel, it's not just about literature. And for me, it's very, very important, again, to question how we tell stories and how we listen to stories, how we replicate, how we turn, how we connect, how we engage with the stories. Because telling stories matter, because they define how we make sense of ourselves, how we make sense of others in this particular time in which we are struggling to imagine the future. So thanks, Amelia.
Thank you
And I'm
so
realizing
much.
I spoke very fast, and yeah, sorry.
No worries at all, Carlos. And thank you so much. That was fascinating. So much fun to learn about the amazing new research that you've been doing. It really opens up a whole new terrain. And I wanted to, we have some time for some questions from the audience members. And I thought I could kind of lead us off, if it's okay, with just a big picture question to tie some of this research together with your earlier research. So I'm interested if you can just maybe talk briefly about the transition that's occurred in your research from your earlier work on socially engaged art practices in the Caribbean and elsewhere to the new research, which focuses on, a more maybe conventional paradigm of artistic production, the novel. Because a lot of the earlier work might have been collaborative or collective in nature, critiquing notions of authorship or sovereignty and so on, which are more kind of preserved in the novel form. So can you talk about that transition and how you see artistic subjectivity and autonomy functioning politically and creatively in those two kind of settings in your past research and current research?
Yeah, thanks a million, Grant, for the question. The first thing I wanted to mention is a very, again, practical material question is that COVID happened, and I ended up reading novels and reading books and engaging with people online, and that changed my approach to many things. But it wasn't just that, so that was part of the story, but not the entire story. I'm very much interested in the novel as a platform where authorship can also be challenged and contested. I know it's not the same. I try not to compare different kinds of processes and fields and mediums. I also try to see how the novel can become the starting point for something else to happen. I'm interested in communities of reading, communities of feeling, communities of affect that happen by telling stories, by making sense of, and by tuning in different moments within long-term processes, because some of the novels I presented are not just novels. They are the result of writers, but also other practitioners bringing different voices together and trying to problematize their own connection with the cultural literary field, but also to think about how writers nowadays can live in this kind of precarious environment that brings them as close as possible to other cultural creators that are also questioning how they create, that are also questioning their role in society and the strategies they develop to collaborate with other communities. So I have to say that the connection also with the novel happens because I needed something to focus on. So this is the starting point. But for example, some of the narratives I'm exploring are reactions to novels. Some of the narratives, some of the processes I'm exploring have to do with people mobilizing themselves and building something up in relation to topics, in relation to, again, stories, voices, stories, not just written stories, just voices, occupations, etc., etc. So it isn't, for me, it's not that different. It's, sorry, I was timing myself on it. This is like so for me there is this connection, although it's not always clear, but I would say for me it's there.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. And there's some questions in the chat. Let's see. I think this is looks like Ricardo maybe. And now this might be kind of similar to my question. Let's see. How do you consider the critical paradox of using an art form, the novel, to critique creative capitalist capture of aesthetic forms to define art, the artist, and art networks now? Oh, thank you. Paulo's putting those in the chat as well. And that may be a similar answer to what I ask. So you pick. I'll read the three. And then what are the historical differences between Balzac's time and now in probably in terms of the novel, kind of cultural function of the novel. Thank you so much for your presentation. Would there be a way to read these novels as not novels at all, but as anti-novels, as cross-genre works that refuse classification? And those questions, are all covering maybe areas that might overlap a little bit. So however you'd like to respond to those.
Yeah, thanks a million for the questions. They are all very pertinent and very useful, I would say. I'll start for the first one. I'll start by engaging with the first one. I would say that there is indeed a contradiction in the process of using a very conventional, very highly modern and highly bourgeois form, genre, that is also object-based, that is also attached to a quite, again, colonial and colonizer cultural market, which is the production of novels and the circulation of novels and the readership of novels. But I would say that there are many writers now trying to reimagine the entire thing. There are, for example, fictions happening in cartoneras, and cartoneras are the result of people coming together, occupying different institutions, and making their own books, making their own stories, but also making space for more things to happen, for a kind of radical imagination beyond the form of the novel. So there is this contradiction at play. My interest is more on narrative and less in the novel form, I would have to say. And I would say that many of the authors I presented today, I mentioned today, are experimenting with different ways of engaging. For example, I mentioned Julian Fuchs, who is not just a novelist, he's someone who plays a very active role in the Sao Paulo cultural scene. I mentioned Maria Gainza. Maria Gainza combines and brings together her work as an academic with her capacity to write novels and her position as a novelist. She's also a feminist activist in Buenos Aires. So most of these authors are not just writers, and I think this is important. Some of them are also going through the kind of precarious mobile working conditions that make them not just aware of different cultural processes, but also establishes a connection between their own role and how they see themselves, not just as writers, but also as part of a broader story, and the writing, the process of writing, and the process of reading and circulating stories. The connection between Balzac and now, I would say that we have moved. So Balzac's story, and it's fascinating for me because it is very much about inventing and circulating the figure of this genius and transferring this creative genius from art to literature and vice versa. But also, Balzac was really obsessed. There's a very interesting book that explains this. Balzac was really obsessed with artists. He wrote more than 40 novels, more than 40 stories about artists. He was fascinated with this figure because this figure allowed himself to explain and to position himself socially, publicly. Okay, I would say that these fictions, these narrations we're exploring today, we are seeing today, are the result of a more, I would say, post-autonomous situation in which, although writers resort to the form of the novel, they are more than that. They don't just rely on their position as writers. They are never just writers. They are always already citizens, precarious subjects. They are always already colonized and colonizer subjects. So I can see that there has been a very important transformation taking place in the way that creative capitalism made the dream of, or tried to make the dream of bringing together art and life possible. And these fictions are about the collapse, I think, of creative capitalism, of the idea that they are about the idea that creative capitalism is a novel, it's a story. And it depends on, it has a powerful impact on us, but it's also something we choose to believe, something that we choose to tell, we choose to reproduce and replicate. So these novels are, for me, about making and engaging with the echo of more stories, of radical stories that are being told, reproduced, here, shared, of people caring in different ways, of people using care as creative work in ways that are not commodifiable, that go beyond the format of the novel. So this is the most important difference, I would say. And in relation to how we can read these novels as not novels at all, I would say yes. I mean, that's the entire point. That this is not just about writers writing novels and readers reading reading the work of writers. It's very much about how we tell stories and how the process of telling, the process of listening, the process of gathering conditions, and is conditioned by our capacity or incapacity to imagine the future. Okay, so I think this is crucial to see these stories as more than novels, I would say. Having said that, they are attached, they are limited, they are connected to, they are controlled, they are inserted into this quite tangible creative capitalist circuit, which is the literary production. And if we talk, I haven't talked about translation, for example, but translation plays a very important role, and translation determines who reads what and how. But I would like also to see how communities of listening, communities of telling are also making important decisions and making important and having an important role in this process.
Great, thank you very much. And maybe I'll drop in another question if that's okay. And if anybody has other questions, feel free to put them into the YouTube chat. Now maybe kind of shifting focus a little bit to this idea about artistic subjectivity. This is kind of an observation / question, which is that on the one hand, there's this argument, I think that that you're making, and you reference Chiapello and Boltanski's sociological research along these lines, which is the transposition of a model of artistic subjectivity into the general population, if you will. And Boltanski and Chiapello link that with May 68 and the kind of attributing a certain artistic critique. The workers aren't so concerned with wage increases and so on as they are with autonomy and freedom in the workplace and being consulted and so on. And so on the one hand, you have this mobilization of artistic subjectivity, but at the same time, the figure of the contemporary artist is still fairly kind of opaque in contemporary culture. I think the novels are an interesting example because that's an unusual situation where people aren't. My own experience is teaching large undergraduate classes, 200 or 300 students, and I ask them how many of them can name 3 contemporary artists, and almost none of them usually can, or a handful, right? Or you get this phenomenon in pop music where once a pop musician gets to a certain stage, they decide they're not a pop artist or star, they're a musician, they're an artist. And so see that with Kanye West or Lady Gaga. There was a controversy with this singer Justin Bieber years ago where he was booed and he said, "You can't boo me because I'm an artist." So being an artist gets mobilized in so many different ways, and yet the general awareness of contemporary art still seems, and this is in a U.S. context, still seems quite, still not a lot of understanding of what artists actually do. And so do you have any thoughts, because you've written on contemporary art, do you have any thoughts about what, once the artistic subject kind of is now mobilized in social media and self-curating and all the rest, does it matter anymore? Do we kind of need, in effect, artists anymore? What function do they serve now that everybody gets to be one on their, their Instagram? That's a little cynical or whatever, but you know what I mean?
No. Yeah, thanks a million, Grant. I mean, excellent question, and it made me think a lot. It's just, so on one hand, like about the relevance of this mobilization of artistic critique as part of the system, I would say that we are seeing very interesting and very dark signs of how quickly things are changing. And I would say that fascism that has been alive and well for a long time, so that it's nothing new. It's something that was conditioning not just politics but also how we socialize for a long time. Is something that is making this distribution, this democratization, whatever we can call it, of artistic critique less relevant nowadays. But also tech, AI, for example, but also how surveillance is applied to creative processes, even to our capacity to be together with others. I would say that this is clearly affecting the relevance of this process of imagining that artistic imperatives are social imperatives. So there is this limitation that I would say is not new. I wanted to emphasize this. So this is not about the last 5 years or the last 10 years. This is something that has been ongoing for a long while, and that now seems to be more prevalent. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that I'm really interested in this idea of the artist novel, which for me is not a novel. It's not a book. It's not because of the idea of being an artist, but rather because of the focus on becoming, and this idea that we can decide what are we becoming. We can decide the future. We can decide. This is a process-based thing that ultimately will kind of democratize the access to, and we can make a connection here with again, social media profiles and profile capitalism, and how platforms allow some degree of flexibility, but also a large degree of boredom and control and vigilance and so on and so forth. So, but at the same time, both writers and artists are imagining the new, are imagining the future, which is not about saying that they are autonomous subjects with a specific, unique condition and capacity to do this. I would say that contemporary art and contemporary literature nowadays are part of a same concern, let's say, or a link to a similar concern for making a space for different forms, different ways of creating in order to make a space for different alternative futures, and futures that are based on radical and tangible and realistic alternatives in the present. How to do that is a difficult question, but I see that arts plays a very important role in that, and artists do as well. So there is a distinction here between this imperative, which is only just not more, not less than an imperative, and how things are put into practice. And my final comment is that novels are not just passive representations of something. Telling stories and mobilizing our voice and occupying different spaces to tell different stories is also making a space for things to happen.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And this, you haven't used the term heteroglossia necessarily, but a lot of what you're saying resonates with things like, Bakhtin's writing on the polyvocal nature of novelistic discourse and the mixing and melding of different voices. So there's a lot there to really work with. Maybe one more question, if I can ask another question, just because it's super interesting for me, just to unpack this a little bit more. So in the presentation, it feels like the focus, and of course it was synoptic, right? You weren't able to really drill down into the 8 or 9 or 10 different novels, but it was focused on more or less on the content structure of the novels in the kind of ways in which they produce meaning. Do you in your research, do you have any work where you're thinking about that novel from the side of the reception by the reader as opposed to the production of meaning by the author, and how, because that seems like it might be consistent with what you're getting at, like a reception paradigm for the novel. Are the ways in which we consume novels, has that changed over time? Is there something going on as that novel is translated through the reader's experience that's notable or what have you?
Yeah, so thanks. Yes, I mean that's the entire point. That to question and to challenge the idea that production and writing happens in this autonomous context, and then is received in this passive through this passive process of readership. Some of the novels and examining are the result of artists and writers collaborating over long time processes, and the reception is already integrated into these novels. In other cases, I'm not interested in the novel itself. I'm interested in how different communities take it to create something new. And by choosing what we read, by choosing the stories we tell, by choosing the names we tell in public, we're also choosing what matters and what doesn't. So I'm very much interested in this blurred space in which production and reception happens. And I would say I can give you an example, and it's not particularly the best example, but I'm thinking about a novel written in Documenta, written as part of a set of writers joining Documenta to do a workshop. and the novel being the result of the novelist sitting there and exchanging with people, and all the feedback, all the input, all the sound and noise and voices becoming the novel, but also this novel being read again and again and being circulated, being shared, not just in the physical commodity object of the novel, but just as ideas, but also through reading clubs, through a process of direct exchange between different communities, and how the novel itself is altered. So many of these examples are not just the end of the process. They are kind of in between, in the middle of processes that are not just about production or reception, not about bringing both together and questioning how these two processes happen in the past and can happen nowadays.
Great. And I see a follow-up from Amy I can read to you. It's also in the chat. Following Grant's question about students not being able to name contemporaries. I mean, those are my like non-majors, of course, but I didn't want to sound like I was being harsh, because sometimes they can come up with some names. I would say the same about students not being able to name contemporary writers, which I can also see. How do the novels or anti-novels engage different modes of writing and reading in the current moment?
So again, the key thing for me is to imagine this as happening beyond the novel and as happening as a space of possibility. So we are recording this, and I'm not sure whether I should say this in public, but I will say this. So artist novel can be also about making space for privilege to be reproduced. And I'm thinking about someone like Mario Vargas Llosa, for example, the Nobel Prize, who decides to write about artists, in this case, quite problematic artists, such as Paul Gauguin, in specific ways to highlight his own position as a literary genius. So I'm not saying that novels, an artist novel and contemporary art novels, are emancipatory or radical. No, I'm saying that there is a space here of possibility that is being mobilized not just by writers, but by a multiple set of creators in many different ways and with multiple intentions. So this is my main concern. Choosing, for example, to read indigenous voices published by indigenous presses is also much more than, let's say, choosing a book or another. And of course, this is strongly linked to teaching as well, and learning and education, because these are choices that I could say affect not just for example, now I coordinate a BA in Portuguese studies in a Northern European country that has this highly Eurocentric tradition. So but nowadays, for example, Ireland is being exposed to migration from different places, and the Irish society is changing very quickly. So choosing the curriculum is more than choosing what we read and what we talk about. It's just by changing the examples, by connecting with people, by reading together, by creating together, we can also decide what scope we want, how many possibilities we can have. And again, I'm not. I want to highlight this again. It's not about differentiating telling from doing. I would say that there are connections and correlations here. Not all the novels do things, but I would say that certain stories and certain ways of narrating make things happen in ways that go beyond fiction.
Great, thank you. And just Sarah followed up, and this you may not need to respond to it. She says, let's see, to put this differently, maybe my question is about the audiences of these works, but you may feel like you kind of addressed that already. I don't want to.
Yeah, it's linked to that. It's linked to the fact that when we discuss literature or art, we cannot just discuss the work of artists and writers. We have to go beyond that. How we go beyond that is not an easy question. It's not an easy process. But I think this is a challenge that's worth taking. But it's also a challenge that writers and artists themselves are embracing, are accepting. So this is not about people criticizing, or this is not about making theory about a literary genre or making theory about a particular way of engaging with creative capitalism. This is about listening to creative practitioners telling their own versions and challenging and struggling creative capitalism by telling the story that creative capitalism is a story.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Are there, just checking to see if there's any more questions in the chat, because we're going to be out of time shortly. Let's see. All right, very good. Carlos, anything you wanted to reference or mention before we conclude?
That it was amazing to be back to San Diego online, that I'm available for anything. So if I'll be happy to share the presentation, I'll be happy to share excerpts of the book. I'll be happy to share whatever can help. So it's been great. And thanks, Emily, for the questions. These were amazing.
Absolutely, and thank you. Oh, I see. There's one last question. Hold on. Okay. To what degree are these art novels experimenting with the narrative form, writing form, or within the form itself? And we'll make that our last question. Yeah.
Coming back to Brazil and coming back to the work of a good colleague, Luciene Acevedo, there is a fantastic novel that is about listening and transcribing and sharing the discourses that the far right prefer in the Brazilian parliament, in Dilma Rousseff's process of impeachment, in the unfair process of, let's say, new authoritarianism in Brazil. So again, this is not about the stories we tell, this is about how. So form is at the center and formal experimentation is at the center, but also there is an interest in this body of fiction, not in all the novels I'm studying, but in many novels I'm studying, in making people participants, in making people read otherwise, in making people engage with stories otherwise, in creating spaces where people can listen to, but also talk to each other in creative ways.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos. It was wonderful to see you, even virtually after all these years. And thank you for the offer to share the materials. If people want to get in touch, I can direct them to you if that's okay for you, and continue that conversation. And until the next time, thank you again so much for sharing your research with us. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're just yeah. We'll hold for a few seconds, Paulo.